Thank you, Sophie, and thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for coming. So yeah, I'm going to start today talking about my job as a forensic speech scientist and how I analyse voices and the context in which I examine voices. So I'll give a bit of a background about what I do and why it is that I do it, and then I'll run through a typical kind of case that we might do in terms of how we analyse a voice, and then I'll talk a bit about developments specifically within forensic speech science and things that are happening at the moment. So I work for a company called JP French Associates, and we are an independent forensic speech laboratory. So we act as expert witnesses in criminal cases. So we're almost a safeguard from, so an expert witness is employed to do a job that the jury can't reasonably be expected to do themselves. So you might have a recording of somebody, a criminal recording in a 999 call or something of that kind. And that's something which you could play those recordings to a jury, but as Sophie's just expressed, there are potential reasons why we might not want to leave that job up to the jury, and we might want to have someone more objective approach that task in a more analytical kind of way. So that's what we do. So in the UK we have an adversarial system, so we're instructed by either prosecution or defence, but our duty is always to the court. So you're there to provide impartial, objective expert evidence. We primarily provide reports, but we can also go and give evidence in court, although increasingly that's less likely for a variety of reasons, which I can talk about if people are interested in. And we primarily do work from the UK, but we do occasionally cases internationally. So this is the team. This is like one of those mugshot research group things. So that's everybody that does it. So me, Rich and James, we're the full-time speaker comparison experts, but then there are a number of other people who work at the firm. So these are the types of different tasks that we can do. I'm going to talk mainly about speaker comparison today, which is where we're comparing voices in different recordings. But we could also do speaker profiling, which is we've got this recording with a voice on it. Can you tell us the accent of the speaker? Can you tell us anything about them? And sometimes there's a disconnect between what people might expect you can tell from someone's voice and what you can actually tell from someone's voice. So we would approach it in a more analytical view, like you might be able to tell features of their regional accent, potentially make some estimations about their age. They're a younger speaker, they're an adult speaker, but beyond that there's not really too much that you can do, but some people might expect that you can tell more. We can produce transcriptions of poor quality recordings. So obviously today we've got the capture, so all of the speech is being transcribed. The next few tasks are less voice related and more kind of recording and acoustic related. So we might be asked to authenticate a recording. Can you tell if this is genuine? Has anyone tampered with it? Can you improve this recording? Can you enhance its quality? Can you figure out where this sound has come from? So we've had cases in the past where noises have been heard in the background, and you can go to a crime scene and try and figure out where it is those sounds might have been made relative to where microphones are and that kind of thing. Audibility of certain sounds. Could this sound be X? Can you hear this sound in the recording? And then also we can sometimes be asked to comment on lay witness identification. So in the same way that you have eyewitnesses to a crime, you can also have ear witnesses to a crime. So you might hear something, or think you recognise somebody, or think you can hear certain content. And there's lots of research about how well listeners can do this and the variability associated with that, and the things that can limit your ability. So your familiarity with the speaker, your distance from the speaker, and all those kinds of factors. So we might be asked to provide a comment on that. So as I said, I'm going to focus on speaker comparison today. So this is the main task that we do. So around 70% of the work that I do on a day-to-day basis is speaker comparison. So we're taking an analytical approach to the voices to compare them for the justice system. So we're provided with a recording of an unknown speaker, and then we'll be provided with recordings of known speakers. And we're asked to compare those to say, how likely is it that they're the same person in each one? I'm not going to play you any actual casework recordings today, for hopefully obvious reasons. But I do have some recordings to demonstrate the type of thing that I'm talking about. So you might have a recording like this. So this is just from a sociolinguistic interview. But it's edited down, so it just contains the speech of one speaker.
I don't think we have the same sense of language or that kind of community spirit, do we? Oh my gosh, don't say the word Mardy. It takes me back to primary school. Some of it is really in the dark and some of it is really clear. Like the Essex side of things is really, really clear. And it was called I Have Landed, and it was all about how his parents' journey to America, and about how interesting it is, and how you want to discover about yourself because of the genetic, biological, innate biological need to know where you've come from. So that's why evolution is so interesting to people.
30 seconds is very long when you're stood up here not doing anything. So you might have an unknown speaker in a recording like that, and then you might be provided with 2 recordings of different speakers and asked to compare. So in this case, we've got 2 recordings of different speakers. So this is the first one.
So she's 54 this year, and he is 2 years older, so he's 56.
And then a different recording.
Because she walks the dogs at the park, so she knows so many people now.
They're slightly better quality, but they're much, much shorter, so you might be asked to compare. Very bad forensic work, but anyone think it was the first person? Anyone think it was the second person? Oh, you're all very good forensic phoneticians because you're not offering a view because you've not done any analysis, which is brilliant. It's actually the first person, but these 2 people are sisters, so their voices are quite similar anyway. You've got very short samples. There's a poor quality question recording, so it's kind of good to be hesitant and cautious with these things. The types of things that can fall into an evidential or a question recording. So it might be telephone calls that have been recorded. So insurance calls are often recorded, and so if they're found to be fraudulent calls, they can then be used as evidence. CCTV footage, so quite often it doesn't have audio recordings, but sometimes it does. Might be covertly recorded footage, so sometimes prison visits can be recorded, or if you ever get arrested and put them in the back of a prison van, don't talk about it because they're probably recording you. Undercover officers can make recordings, and obviously then they need to be, they're not in and of themselves necessarily enough to sort of say you might want further analysis doing. And lots of other types of audio recordings. So obviously lots of things are recorded. We're all aware of that every day, how increasingly things are becoming recorded. So there are lots of different things which can become evidential depending on the nature of a case. In terms of what we can use as reference recordings, so more often than not, they're police interviews. So since kind of the mid-80s, all police interviews now have to be recorded, and they can then be disclosed and used as a reference sample of someone's voice. Obviously, in a police interview, there's no obligation for anybody to answer any questions, so they might not always provide a source of reference material of a voice because the person might just not speak. So there are other sources, so custody footage, so when you get taken into a police station and booked in, there are cameras around and microphones recording everything. They're often very poor quality, so they're often not actually suitable for any kind of detailed analysis, but they are often submitted to screen. Other types of telephone calls, so all 999 calls are recorded, all calls to police are recorded. You probably all sat there thinking, oh gosh, I'm never going to speak again. Everything's recorded. We can also sometimes provide our own recordings, so we can arrange to have people kind of call us at our laboratory, and we can record a telephone call which we can then use as a reference sample. And again, lots of other audio recordings. So this is just to give you a flavour of the type and range of material that we might have to deal with. And the question is always, is the unknown speaker the suspect in a speaker comparison case, or is speaker A speaker B in this other recording? So in order to approach that question, we use, in England and Wales, the primary approach is a combined auditory and acoustic approach. That's how it's referred to kind of in the courts and in our reports. But basically this is the application of phonetic and sociolinguistic analysis. So this is looking at how an analysis of vowels and consonants, the way we produce those sounds, looking at our disfluency patterns, all kind of different aspects of the voice to be able to characterise it using those methods. So all the kind of things that you learn about when you study phonetics and sociolinguistics, these analysis methods are then applied in a forensic context to allow you to analyse a voice. So I'll talk a bit more about this. I'm going to go through a case in principle kind of thing. So you're trying to characterise the voice in as much detail as you can for every single sample that you analyse. And then you can then compare across the different samples based on the findings that you have. So case example, you might have the question, so in this case that we worked on a couple of years ago, so we had covert car material, and it was from 2 days. They'd basically recorded a car for 2 solid days. And rather than do speaker comparison, there were specific sections where the car was occupied, and there were multiple speakers in the car at any one time. and they wanted us to kind of extract speech from different speakers in those sections and then compare it to a number of different suspects to see whether any of the suspects were in any of the samples. So for one of the speakers, one of the reference speakers, we ended up with 5 different question samples, so 4 different sections from day 1 and 1 section from day 2. So this was from covert car material that was taken from a bug. We also had a range of reference material, so this was all for one speaker. There were 4 different potential sources of reference material, but 2 of these weren't used, so I'll talk through these. So one of these was custody footage. So I mentioned before that can often be very poor quality, and there are lots of things going on, as you might imagine, in a police station. So this wasn't used because it wasn't analysable, it wasn't suitable for any analysis. We also had a police interview, so this was the more typical kind of reference material that we can get. And also some, so the last 2 here are actually the same material but recorded in 2 ways. So the covert car material, at the end of the 2 days, the police actually came and stormed the car, as it were, and they were wearing body-worn cameras. So there's a point at which, in the footage, the police turn up. So you've got a covert recording of that incident from the bug that's in the car, but you've also got a recording of that incident from the police officer's body-worn camera. So you can see in the camera who the speaker is, so it's known material rather than question material, but you've got 2 versions of it, so you can assess which is better quality. So in this case, the car material from that point could be related to the body-worn camera footage, and then that's supplementary reference material to the police interview. So you produce all these different samples for comparison. So we've got 5 question samples, all to be analysed separately and compared to each other, and then also the reference material, and you're comparing the reference material to each of those separate samples. So one of the types of analysis that we do, so this is probably very phonetics heavy, the next few slides, so don't worry if it makes no sense at all, because I'm going to talk through it. But one of the things that we do is an F0 analysis, or a pitch, so how high or how low someone speaks. And we measure this long term across the whole recording, so it's kind of an average pitch. So you can see here the kind of summary here, that top bit that shows their pitch variation across a whole recording, and we can get a figure that represents the average of that. And then we can also look at the distribution of their pitch throughout a recording. And that's one thing that you can look at for every single sample, and then you can compare across it. Now, this particular feature is something which varies a lot within a speaker. So when we are analysing voices, we're often thinking about within speaker variation and between speaker variation. And one of the problems associated with speaker comparison, and which reflects the way we express our conclusions, which I'll talk about, is the fact that within speaker variation can often be bigger than between speaker variation. So the variation you have in your own voice is bigger than that someone else who might have the same accent as you. So in this case, it's quite useful because we have 2 sources of reference material, so we can actually have a bit more of a look at that within speaker variation for across the reference samples, and then we can compare it to each of the question samples as well. So we've got multiple reference samples, and then on each aspect of the analysis, we summarise the findings and interpret those findings. So one of the big things that as an expert is to be able to interpret the findings and what that actually means. So here you can see that the mean values are all within a similar range. It's kind of a bit like it doesn't really tell you anything. Like, yes, they're similar, but they're not particularly unusual. It's not inconsistent with them being the same speaker, but at the same time it doesn't point to them not being different speakers. Like, there could be 6 different speakers in here, there could be 1 speaker across all of these recordings, because pitch in and of itself doesn't give you enough. But there's nothing that points to it being different speaker categorically, if you know what I mean. So another thing that we look at is formants. So these are measured on vowels, and they're parts of the signal that we can measure. Anyone who's done phonetics, you tend to measure the first and second formant, and you can plot them, and they correspond, you can get a nice vowel space out of them here. They correspond to kind of your vocal tract, and your vocal tract configuration when you're speaking. They tend to relate to kind of a bit more of an individual feature in terms of your vocal tract shape, but also the accent that you have. So again, it's taking all these things in combination when you come to your interpretation. So this here is a summary for the 2 reference samples and the question sample. And the thing that you can take from this is that the question samples are clearly shorter and more limited, so there aren't really many black tokens on here. And that's often the case. So a question sample is often more limited than the reference samples that you get, and there's often less analysis that you can do. But there are similarities in kind of the overall vowel space, and then you can also get a summary on the left of how many tokens you can measure. Too much phonetics, sorry. And then the other thing that we can look at with formants is what's called the F3, so that's the third formant. And we measure this, again, long term across a whole recording. So this doesn't vary so much by individual vowel. It tends to be something which is consistent across a speaker. But again, the within speaker variability, well, the between speaker variability, most people are around average, and average can be from kind of like 2.45 to 2.5. So there's quite a big range of averages, but you can see in these samples, most are around average, ones slightly below average. But again, they're similar across, but they're fairly typical for what we might expect. As well as measuring the acoustics of the vowel, we're also doing kind of an auditory analysis of the vowels, and then we're also looking at the consonants as well, how people produce the different consonants, and we're trying to get an overall impression of their phonology. Now, there are obviously limits to how much of a system you can get from a sample, because not in every sample you're not going to get every vowel and consonant, but you try and get as big of a range as you can in each sample. So this is the kind of thing you get for one sample, and then on the left you've got a summary of the vowels. And an important thing that we do as part of this stage is you characterise the accent of the speaker, and this is very important for when you're actually arriving at your conclusion. So the variety in this case for this particular sample was an East Midlands area accent with urban/contact features. Our accent descriptions are often very convoluted and very long, and sometimes they're not very descriptive at all, and that's because of lots of problems which I'll talk about in a minute. But that helps you when you are arriving at your conclusion, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. The last thing that we always look at is voice quality, and this is something which is done kind of more auditorily. It's more a holistic impression thing. So it's primarily, it was initially developed to look at speech pathologies, and as part of speech and language therapy, this particular tool was developed, and it's increasingly being used in kind of social linguistics, and especially in forensics. There's a lot of research into how this is applied in speaker comparison work, and it allows you to look at long-term settings of the vocal tract rather than individual vowel and consonant realizations. So does somebody have a particularly raised larynx all the time that they're speaking? So it's considering lots of long-term settings that are present across the voice. So again, you can see here, this is demonstrating the within speaker variability for the two reference samples, and you can produce that for each of the different samples and then compare across. So you do all this analysis and you've got all these findings for all these different samples, and then we have to arrive at a conclusion. So what are we actually going to give to the court in terms of that they can then use to interpret? Because you can't just give them the F0 findings and the formants. That's not going to make any sense to a jury at all. Have to provide this in a useful way. So what we're doing is we're assessing the similarity and the typicality of the samples. So how similar are these recordings? Are there differences, and why are they differences? Are there differences because that's within speaker variation? Are there differences because that's between speaker variation and it's different speakers? And also how typical are the features? And this is the kind of really important thing, and this is why we need the accent description, because you can only assess how typical a feature is if you know the accent of the speaker. So for example, in multicultural London English, which is a variety of English which has been studied quite a lot, it's been found that H preservation is actually kind of coming back. So instead of dropping your H's, speakers of this variety are actually retaining their H's. And if you're not aware of that fact and you get a speaker who retains their H, and you don't know that in MLE it's typical to retain your H's, you give undue weight to that feature in your assessment of the findings, which is potentially going to mean you're going to give a stronger conclusion, even though it's a very typical feature that lots of speakers of that accent would have. So in this particular case that I've just gone through, there were similarities between each question sample and the reference material in all the features analysed. The differences were associated with variations in speaking style, so it was consistent with kind of within speaker variation. But most of the features found were very typical for the accent type, which was the East Midlands area accent with contact features. So you've got a lot of similarities, but a lot of them are typical, but they're present across all of the recordings. So then you have to take that and then put it into a conclusion. So when forensics first started, I hate saying it, they used to do categorical decisions, which just seems completely ludicrous. So this is or this isn't this person, and I'm sure that anybody who has any experience working with voices knows just how ludicrous that sounds. Like we know how much voices vary within a speaker, between a speaker. The idea that you could give a categorical decision on this is just Oh, God. So then we move to classical probability scales, and then we move to this UK position statement. Now, the UK position statement kind of did this stage, but then didn't produce a conclusion. So it would say you've got a consistency rating of 3 or 4, and you've got a distinctiveness rating of 2. But it didn't then interpret that into something which could really be understood by the jury. So the jury doesn't really know what that means. So now, since 2016, we've been using a verbal support statement, which is more in line with a lot of other forensic sciences anyway. And this basically is this scale here. So in the middle, you have inconclusive. So the results do not provide support for either view. And then you have 6 points above this and 6 points below this for the view that the suspect either is or is not the speaker in the question sample. And what this does is it gives you a range to be able to express the similarity and the typicality. You're not given any categorical decisions. And what this also does is takes into account that there are other speakers of that variety who may share those. So, for example, limited support is there are similarities, but there aren't many of them. It's not a very good sample. There's not much I could do. And there are probably lots of other people who would fit this profile. Whereas extremely strong support for either the view that it is or isn't the speaker, you'd be like, there's loads of similarities or there's loads of differences. And I couldn't eliminate the possibility that they were the same person or they weren't, but given the scale of the similarities of the differences, it's very unlikely. So in the case that I talked through, for each of the question samples, there was moderately strong support for the view that the suspect was the question speaker in each of those. So you can see it's consistent with there are similarities, there are a range of them across all of the features analysed, but a lot of them are quite typical for the accent type. So there's probably a pool of other people who would speak with similar features, and I don't know how big that pool is, but there are still similarities. So developments, have I got time to go through this?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So one of the big things that's happening at the moment is the UK Forensic Regulator. So this was set up quite recently, and they basically set the standards for forensic science as a whole. So not just forensic speech science, but generally across the forensic sciences. So there's a few different documents and publications that set those standards in terms of how you should carry out analysis and what's best practice, what's your job as an expert, and all those kinds of things. And one of the big things is that it now involves accreditation by the UK Accreditation Service. And that means that you need to be compliant with ISO 17025. You need to validate your method, so you need to demonstrate that your method does what you say that it does. So we apply methods of phonetics and sociolinguistics, but can we demonstrate that those methods enable you to distinguish between speakers and find similar speakers? And also competency tests for the analysts. So you say you know all about phonetics and linguistics, but can you apply this auditory and acoustic method in a way that enables you to do this job properly? So this is what the regulator's been brought in to do. Currently the forensic science is unregulated, and I could talk about that a lot, but I won't. So basically one of the big things is that it allows us to move away from assessments of typicality and similarity that historically have always been based on the eminence and the experience of an expert. So you'd get an expert go into court, oh, I've got 30 years experience, I've heard all these voices, I think this is a typical feature, which isn't really an objective way to arrive at a decision of what is or isn't unusual. And what it moves us towards is more replicable, scientifically defensible, objective, and also data-driven methods. So can we objectively say this is a typical feature? So for example, the MLE example, there's research which talks about the typicality of H preservation in that variety, and that's much better than going into court and saying, oh, well, I think this is typical, so I've given it strong, which is obviously not very good. Now, accreditation is not yet mandatory for all forensic sciences, and given the way that the system is at the moment, it's small independent businesses like the one that I work for. So the UK Forensic Science Service was disbanded. Obviously, it's much more complicated for small independent businesses to get accredited on their own than it is for kind of large government organisations to do that. So DNA and fingerprinting are the only current services that have to be accredited. So police forces can only instruct accredited laboratories, and it's likely that this will progress to other sciences soon. So what we're doing is the Chartered Society for Forensic Services, they're running like a small business help thing basically, where you can plug into documentation and assistance that they provide that then gets you UCAS ready within kind of 12 months or so. So that's the way that we're going about it, but there's not kind of a kind of set way to do it. And the other thing which I feel like I should talk about when I talk about forensics is automatic systems. So this is where you would have a machine that could compare voices, and this is the kind of thing that banks have as part of their big systems that they maybe run recordings through lots and lots and lots. And a lot of research is focused on this area in forensic speech science. So there are kind of two main limitations to actually adopting this in real life in casework. One of them is reference populations. So automatic systems rely on huge databases of reference populations that they can compare speakers against. So you can put like your reference speaker in with all the database speakers, and then you've got your question sample, and does it pick your reference speaker out? But there are problems with those reference populations in terms of what are their characteristics, because quite often, I think one of the big automatic speakers providers just has male speakers of British English, and that's it. So they might have 1,000 speakers, but is it enough that they're just speakers of British English, or do we need to actually reflect the kind of diversity of voices that we get in the UK in a more kind of detailed way? And also the quality of forensic recordings, so particularly in the UK. So in some European countries you can use telephone intercepts, so the quality of those is much more consistent. We don't use those in the UK, they're not evidentially legal. So the quality of our forensic recordings is very variable and often very poor, and they're not good enough to put through a system that is used to dealing with studio quality recordings to carry out that work. And if you have a mismatch between the recordings, then that throws up all kinds of other problems as well. Now, it is used in some jurisdictions, and it's often used as an additional method. So in addition to doing auditory and acoustic analysis, I know in Canada and in Sweden and possibly in the Netherlands as well, you might use this as an additional method in addition to auditory and acoustic analysis, but not in the UK. And there was also appeal court rulings, which I meant to talk about with formants, but I didn't. These are often how things happen in kind of forensics, is you'll get an appeal court ruling and then that will filter down. So there was a case in 2015 where automatic systems were used in addition to auditory and acoustic methods as part of an analysis, and the judge ruled that the science was currently not in a fit state to allow them to be used as part of auditory and acoustic analysis. So as it stands, we're not using automatic methods. I think ultimately they will become another tool, but they're not currently good enough for us to be able to rely on them. And I don't think it would ever be the baby out with the bathwater. I think we'll always rely on kind of phonetics and linguistics. And I remember, I don't know when it was, when they started doing acoustic analysis in addition to auditory analysis at one point, and there was a lot of discussion about formants and kind of where they're going to replace auditory analysis, and actually it ends up we just do everything now. We do a combined approach, and I imagine that what will happen is that ultimately we'll use automatic in addition, and the expert will interpret all of those facts in the same way we do with everything else. That's me done. Sorry.